All right, it's on YouTube now, and I think we can start now. Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening here from Jogja in Indonesia, and good morning there in the US. Welcome to Wednesday Forum. This is a weekly discussion that is held by both the Center for Religious and Cross-Cultural Studies, or CRCS, at the Graduate School of Gadjah Mada University in Jogja, as well as the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, also located at the Graduate School of Gadjah Mada University. And I'm Aziz, a staff member at CRCS. I'm going to be the host for this forum, and we already have our speaker today, Dr. Ari Gordon, who is the director of the U.S. Jewish Muslim Relations for the American Jewish Committee. He was doing his dissertation about the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish relations during Islam's formative periods. And he can also speak Hebrew, English, of course, and Arabic. And he is going to talk about, well, the title is Combating Both Anti-Semitism and Anti-Muslim Bigotry, not only in the West, I guess, but also in the global context. How do we face the challenges, whether there are opportunities to bridge the gap or to build solidarity between these two different communities, but of one family of the Abrahamic religions. And I guess Dr. Ari Gordon or Ari is going to talk also about the current state of affairs of the Muslim-Jewish relations in the U.S. During this tense political climate. And I believe that most of you who are here, including Indonesians, are following what is happening now in the U.S. about the election. We can, ask or talk about it with Ari later. And for those of you who are going to ask questions or make comments, you can write down your comments or questions on the chat feature of this Zoom, or you can write down your questions on our YouTube channel comment section. And if you want to uh, show your face, and you can also ask questions by raising your virtual hands, and I will let you to for you to speak later. So without further ado, Ari, as you have known our way of managing this forum, this will last for 90 minutes. And for the first half, you will be presenting your ideas. You will share your experiences, perhaps. And later, for the rest of the time, we will have discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Ari Gordon. And it's yours.
Well, thank you, Aziz, and to Professor Pafras, and to the center, to CRCS, IGCRS, and it's wonderful to be with you this evening and morning here for me, the day after the U.S. election day, when many people are following a very close election, and we can talk about that a little bit. It is related to our topic today, but it is not the topic today. Today, we're talking about a very negative topic. We're talking about hate. We're talking about anti-Jewish hatred and anti-Muslim hatred. And although they are different, we are talking about what we can do as an Abrahamic family, specifically as Jews and Muslims, but there's a role for Christians as well, and all humanity to fight back against hatred. But I want to go back to my own childhood, because if you think also about your own childhood, when you discovered the idea of hatred, and I don't mean one child being mean to another kid on the schoolyard. We have all experienced someone being mean in the past. What I'd like to talk to you about, though, is what it was like when you thought about someone who was mean or hated you because of your religion or because of your ethnicity or your identity. For me, I grew up as an Orthodox Jew in the United States. I grew up in Philadelphia. I live in New York City now. But when I grew up, I went to Jewish schools. My synagogue, the place where my Jewish place of prayer, was only other Jews. In the summer, when I went to a camp or a youth group, it was also a Jewish setting. And so I did not meet people of other religions. Of course, we were told stories about others. We knew that maybe there was something negative out there. But in general, we were taught about the good of humanity, that all people have human dignity, that all people are beloved to their creator, that God created all humans and therefore we should love all humans. However, I remember growing up in that community, and my college was also an Orthodox Jewish college, and I learned about other religions. And I wanted to know more, and I wanted to build bridges between faith communities. So I started working at American Jewish Committee. This was about 15 years ago. In between, I did get some graduate degrees. I studied Arabic and Islam and the history of Muslim Jewish Christian relations. But I remember at that time when I was working at AJC, American Jewish Committee, meeting Dr. Ken Stern. And Ken Stern is the founder of the field of hate studies. And maybe you didn't know, there's the study of history, the study of chemistry, study of religion. There is a field of hate studies. And Dr. Stern helped found the journal and is one of the experts in that field. And I remember what he said when I heard him teach and speak. He said, hate is something that is part of the human condition. Hatred will always be there as part of humanity. And for me, as a young person, I had just graduated college, it was very surprising to hear someone say that. I came into the field of interreligious relations and building bridges because I believed that we can share so much in common and that we can focus on the things that bring us together and that the things that divide us, we can overcome them. But what he made me realize is that whenever there is human difference, there will always be those who wish to exploit it or to use it for hatred or who tell that story. And this makes sense to me. At first it was upsetting, but then I understood part of what it means to be human and part of what it means for us is that we live in communities. We have religions, we have countries, we have ethnic groups, and we can celebrate these identities. Amy Chua, a scholar in the United States, talks about tribes. She uses the words tribes and tribalism. But what she says about identity is that I may have my identity as an individual, Ari Gordon, with my own family and interests and beliefs, and I have my identity as part of a human family. But part of what it means for us to be human is that we also have group identities, our religion, our country, our ethnicity, our culture. And it's okay that my religion defines itself not just as Judaism, but also as not Christianity and not Islam. These are differences, and God celebrates these differences. We know that all of our traditions, including Hinduism and Buddhism, celebrate diversity. We have verses in our scriptures that celebrate difference. But we also know that for all people out there, when there is difference, there is the potential for hatred. And when we talk about anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim hatred in particular, it comes first on the fundamental acknowledgement that there are human groups out there, and when we have groups, groups can become a target. And this has something to do with the symbolism that these identities carry. I may never meet someone who is of a different religion. You may never meet someone who is Jewish, but you have heard something about Judaism. someone in my community may never meet someone who is Muslim, but they have heard something about Islam. And this gets me into, again, the mechanics of hatred. And I would think about three different ways that we think about hate being expressed. And the first is in attitudes, in what happens in the mind, in thoughts. And because there are these identities are made out of symbols, they can also be carried in the mind in that way. If I see a newspaper headline that says, the Jewish candidate for president said X, the Jewish state did something else. Or if, as many Americans and many Jews read in our headlines, Islam teaches X, a Muslim did this act of violence. Christianity, Christian supremacist identity led someone to do something. So in my mind, that shapes an attitude. So attitudes is one. Number two is rhetoric. It can come out in speech, hateful speech. I say something negative about the other community. And the third is in action. And we have seen this, unfortunately, in the years around us, violent action between religious communities that is based in hatred. Of course, there is all kinds of violence out there, whether it's violence against people or against buildings, violence in marriages and families. But what we are talking about is a hate crime, what we would call in the United States a hate crime, because it is violence that is based on hatred of another group identity. And so now we are 2 years, just a little more than 2 years after the largest anti-Jewish hate crime murder in the United States in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where someone came in and murdered dozens of Jews who were praying in their synagogue. We also know that nearly 50 people were murdered in New Zealand while they were praying because they are Muslim. And in Sri Lanka as well in the same year in a church on Easter, because they were Christian, they were killed. So we think about attitudes, thoughts that can sometimes come out in speech and sometimes come out in violent action. These are some of the mechanics of hatred. Now, when we talk specifically about anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bigotry, these are very big topics in the world. I am going to draw mostly from my own experience in the United States, working with Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities here, although it is similar, if not connected, to other parts of the world. And maybe during our discussion, I can learn from you about what things look like in Indonesia and some of the other places that you are familiar with. But before I get into, what is anti-Semitism, what is Islamophobia or anti-Muslim bigotry, I want to talk about some of the problems in thinking about different forms of hatred together. The first challenge is something that, Aziz, you mentioned, the election and the identity politics. This is a term that if you have not heard it, you should learn more about: identity politics and polarization. These are very active words in the United States public discourse right now, in Europe, and in many parts of the world. Ezra Klein wrote a book in the United States this year called Why We Are Polarized. He's the founder of a political news outlet called Vox, V-O-X News. And what he noted is that it was not the last 4 years, although President Donald Trump is a figure that makes many people very active and upset on both sides, in his party and in the other political party. He did not begin polarization. The idea that we take on very extreme views, extreme political views that are against the other side. This happened for the last 20 or 25 years and maybe even more. And something that comes with that polarization is my political identity becomes connected to my cultural or religious identity. And so we see different groups that become attached in their religious and ethnic and cultural identity to political ideas. And it's also true that for some of our politicians, they look at a Jewish identity or at a Muslim community identity, and they can use it in a political way. And I will give you one example here. We as Jews see both the Democratic and the Republican Party, both parties in the United States, want to tell us or send the message that Jews should vote for them, that their political home is with that party. And what we hear from some on the polarized left, the progressive camp, is look at those Republicans. They are white supremacists. They are a group of people who hate Jews and all minorities. We are the defenders of racism and hatred in America. This is your political home. And we hear on the political right, on the polarized right, all of those people in the progressive camp, all of those Democrats, they hate Israel and they hate Jews. They hate the Jewish state. They are anti-Semitic. We are the only defenders of Jewish identity and Jewish interests. You belong here. For Muslims in the United States, we see some in the Republican Party. Again, I'm not talking about everyone in one party or the other. I'm talking about certain extreme voices that will say all Muslims are a security threat. And there is signaling that when you talk about Islam or Muslims, you are talking about the security of the United States of America and a danger to it. And some will see this in immigration policy, in religious freedom issues. We see a similar debate coming up in France and in Europe today, in certain voices in those communities. And then we see in the other party, in the far progressive left, those who are saying everyone who doesn't agree with progressive policies must be Islamophobic and anti-Muslim. And any Muslim who votes for a Republican is a traitor, is against their identity. And I bring up this example because it's one of the problems when we talk about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It is very hard to separate it from politics. And I believe very strongly that when we politicize hatred, when we make racism or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or any kind of hatred a matter of politics, we are losing something. And we are limiting our ability to really fight it, because we see Islamophobia from the right and Islamophobia from the left. We see anti-Semitism from the right and we see it from the left. We can talk more about the sources, but one of the challenges is polarization and identity politics. Another problem that I see among both Jews and Muslims, is that there is fear of watering down the fight against anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. That somehow, if I am fighting these hatreds together, I will lose something about my own. And there's a counterpart. You know, many people on this call are familiar with interreligious dialogue. Sometimes you hear people say, well, all the religions are really the same. We worship the same God, we pray, we eat, we this, that, and the other. I think that when you say we are all the same, you lose what is special about each religion, and you lose the ability to have a true conversation between religions. In fighting hatred, it is true as well, that to actually fight hatred together, we need to acknowledge where it's the same and where it's different. The last challenge, I would say, is the mistrust, the suspicion that many Jews and many Muslims have of one another. Much of this comes because we don't know each other, and we see each other through the lens of international politics, perhaps the Middle East. We think that only those stories that are told negatively about Muslims and Jews hating one another or doing violence to one another, that is the true story. And we can talk about the challenges that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Muslims in the Middle East, we can talk about how that comes into this conversation, because we should. We have to name the issues that are there, even if they are difficult. So this is another challenge. But what we have seen at American Jewish Committee, and with the work I will talk about later, the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, and some of our work across the world, is that we have a power. We have a power when we work together that we don't have when we work alone. When Jews or AJC stand up against Islamophobia, against anti-Muslim bigotry, it is a powerful voice, because it is not only Muslims who are fighting against that hatred. When our Muslim partners and Christian partners as well stand up against anti-Semitism, against anti-Jewish bigotry, it is powerful, because it is not just Jews who are saying that this is a problem. You know, and American Jewish Committee just published a study of anti-Semitism in the United States, and we found that while 85% of Jews felt that anti-Semitism is on the rise, anti-Jewish feeling is on the rise, only about 43%, I think, only about half of that number of non-Jews felt the same way. So sometimes, and it's true in studies of American Muslim attitudes as well, that sometimes we know that there is hatred out there, but we need allies in that fight. And sometimes others who are not in our community don't experience it that way. So let me talk a little bit about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia before we jump into what we can do together and some of the other challenges. I think it's very helpful to talk about some of the similarities and some of the differences when we talk about these two. And I think about two areas where we could talk about similarities, things that relate to religion and things that relate to power and politics. And then one area of difference where I will discuss it, and that has to do with hatred against our communities, that for Jews is connected to the Middle East and Israel, and for Muslims is connected to a perception of a connection to terrorism. These are difficult conversations. I appreciate that everyone on this call is open to these challenging talks. But let's go back to religion. One of the earliest forms of Islamophobia, of anti-Muslim sentiment, came in the Christian-Muslim conflicts around the Crusades. We're talking about in the Middle Ages, where conflicts between between Muslims and Christians turned into a religious-based hatred. And sometimes this came out in debates about whether Jesus was a prophet or the Son of God. Sometimes it came out in the form of wrong beliefs about God or about prophecy. And we know that that is attitudes. Sometimes it was in the form of speech and scholarly writing that we still have. And we know that the Crusades and some of the bloody conflicts between Christians and Muslims in battles for the Holy Land was something that was motivated by religion and identity. And today, those Islamophobic sentiments are still there. There are many people in the West and elsewhere who believe that Islam teaches against human rights, against other religions, and violence, that it is a religion, that the religious texts teach these things. And some of our job as allies in the Jewish community and in the Christian community as well is to fight back against those perceptions. You know, a recent study from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, an American Muslim think tank, showed that among all the religious groups in the country, Jews had the least anti-Muslim sentiment. And they measured, do you think Islam is a religion of violence? You know, and the lowest number, maybe 8% of Jews said yes. Do you think that Islam teaches something against women? And Jews felt very low on this one as well. And what that tells me, I'm not telling you this to celebrate Judaism, but what it tells me is that we have allies. There are friends out there who can help push back against this religious perception against Islam. And for Jews as well, one of the oldest forms of anti-Semitism is a religious-based hatred that says Jews did not believe in Jesus as the Messiah, Jews did not believe in Muhammad, our beliefs about the Torah, about religion, about things were wrong. And Judaism, therefore, is a religion that thinks that all other religions are wrong, that we are the chosen ones of God, and therefore there's something wrong with Judaism. And we know from so many of our conversations with American Muslim and American Christian and Buddhist and Hindu and other partners, when they meet Jews and when they learn about Judaism, they also learn about these open pluralistic teachings that see God speaking to many communities in many different ways, and the value of human diversity, that we know God created diversity, and therefore diversity is a sacred aspect of our lives and our work. So we can push back against hatred that is based on religion, hatred against Islam and Judaism, if not against Muslims and Jews, and we can do it together. That's one area is anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bigotry based on religion. Another is based on politics and power. And this usually has more to do with Jews and Muslims than Islam and Judaism. And what I mean by that is, and this is something that is similar in both forms of hatred, that you cannot trust Jews and you cannot trust Muslims because and this is true in where we are minority communities in Europe and the United States, that there are those who wish to say, you cannot trust us because our goal is to dominate the government, is to take over the world or the country. And somehow secretly, even though we are saying that we are helping the country or that we are participating in politics and government as an American, as a French citizen, as a German citizen, really what we are trying to do is to politically overthrow everything. That is the similarity. Now let me talk about the difference. What we have learned about regarding Islamophobia is a term that you may have heard, but we hear a lot. It's called stealth jihad, secret jihad. So many people will read in the media those terrible stories of violence that we know does not represent Islam or Muslims. But what some people are teaching about is a secret plan for Muslims to overthrow the government. And we at American Jewish Committee, when we hear people naming this, we push back and we say that is based on hatred, that is based on Islamophobia. We work with elected officials, we work with civil society members and religious leaders to defend the right of Muslims in the United States to participate in public life, to have a voice in politics. And something that you see in this election was that American Muslim communities came together to bring out Muslim voters. And while there were some people who say that is something that we should be afraid of, as Jews, we stand up and we say, no, that is what America is about. It's about different voices and different communities shaping the public square. We cannot be afraid of the empowerment of any community. For Jews in this area, in the area of politics and power, I'll take you back to a work you may have heard of called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this is a book that was completely false. It was fabricated and proven to be so by the Russian Empire, the Tsar, in the 19th century and early 20th century, but has circulated in so many languages in so many places. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion tells a story about Jews who are secretly trying to control the economy, the government, the media, to take over the world, to corrupt the values of the world, and to own and dominate everything. And we see that those conspiracy theories, just like I told you about with the anti-Muslim conspiracy theory of trying to take over Sharia law everywhere, the anti-Jewish conspiracy theory says that that when you see bad things happening in the world, somehow behind the scenes, it's Jewish power that is doing this. And we see this today in the coronavirus and COVID shutdowns. There are people who said it's the Jews who have spread this virus. We see this when there's economic failure, that people point to Jewish investors, Jewish finance people who must be responsible. We see this in the Middle East when there are overthrows of certain governments in Arab countries, that this must be the Jews behind it. I know a friend of mine and a colleague at American Jewish Committee. She grew up in Pakistan, and she told me that sometimes people will say, you know, I got sick. It must be the Jews, almost as a joke. If there's traffic on my way to work, it must be the Jews. And some of this conspiracy theory that we somehow have a magical power to control things is one area of anti-Semitism that is a real challenge to fight. And we see this on both sides on social media, that it's very easy in social media for someone to just type a few words and send it to thousands of people. And now the seed has been planted that this particular Muslim leader is really trying to spread Sharia. This particular Jewish leader is trying to overthrow the government. You know, we see this if we go back to some of those violent crimes that we talked about, let's say in New Zealand and in Pittsburgh, in the synagogue where Jews were shot. The people who committed those crimes, when we look at their manifestos, at their writings, the beliefs that motivated those actions, we see many of these conspiracy theories there. The person who shot those Jews in the synagogue in Pittsburgh had posted on social media, I won't say it exactly because he used some very nasty language, but he said, it is those evil Jews who are helping the evil Muslims come into the country. He thought that Jewish advocacy on immigration and helping refugees from Muslim majority countries come to the United States is somehow going to overthrow the United States. And it will no longer be the place that he knew, but it will become some corruption of that. And we see some language, some hateful language in Europe that is telling a similar story. So these conspiracy theories are very difficult to fight. It's very difficult, especially when people don't know one another. If you don't know a Jewish person, or you don't know Jewish communities, if my community doesn't know Muslim people or Muslim communities, it's easy to allow the media to shape our image. It's easy to allow those very difficult, those very critical voices to shape the story. You know, something I see in the United States was that after 9/11, after the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers, which happened at the same time as a very active conflict in the Middle East, in Israel, Palestine, so many Americans were getting our information about Islam and Muslims from only those voices that were looking at extremism, that were looking at terrorism. And it shaped the mindset of so many Americans. And I have to tell you, it shaped the mindset of some people in my community as well. And what I can say 20 years later is that there are so many people coming together to push back against that. And that has happened because we are not afraid to stand together. We have found allies among Muslim communities, and they have found allies in our communities. And we know that hatred is bad for everyone, especially when it is based on fear and misinformation. And I would say something that we are seeing, and we see this now, especially in the Arab world, that for many, many decades, a perception of Jews that was shaped based exclusively on an anti-Israel sentiment or an anti-Semitism that had to do with Zionism was shaping the perception of Jews everywhere. And now, decades later, it's not that has disappeared. It's not that that conversation is easy, but we're seeing some changes. And you see this in the signing of the Abraham Accords, where the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have signed peace treaties. You see this in my own organization, American Jewish Committee, works closely with Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, with Sudan, with Morocco, with Egypt, with Jordan, with the Palestinian Authority, with all kinds of religious leaders and political leaders across the Arab world. And when we sit at the table together, we learn more about them, and we are able to help the Jewish community understand them. And also they come to appreciate that those conspiracy theories and all that's there does not need to shape the relationship. The last thing I'll say in terms of the types of hatred, I referenced here before. On the anti-Muslim side, this is the perception around violence and terrorism. And I should tell you, in my own background, I'm someone who did my PhD in Islamic studies and in Arabic. I told you I grew up in the Orthodox Jewish community. I love Judaism and I love my Jewish practice. And in my study of Islam and in my friendships with many Muslim people, I have come to love Islam and Muslims as well. So when I talk to you about extremism and terrorism, you're not speaking to someone who believes that this is the religion. In fact, I know that it is a false interpretation of the religion. And it is an expression of the religion. And when someone says they are doing this in the name of Islam, that this hurts so many of my Muslim friends. And they say, how dare you take my religion and make it about terrorism? And unfortunately, so many people in the world do not know that. And they believe that there is some connection between Islam and terrorism. And some of our goal when we do Muslim-Jewish dialogue and when we do Muslim-Jewish advocacy together is to help those voices, like so many around the world, and I know in Indonesia in particular, a strong voice of anti-extremism, and to help tell those stories. And I'll tell you, in my own work, very often we will get emails from people who will say, you know, you work in Muslim-Jewish relations. Why don't I ever hear Muslim voices condemning terrorism? We hear this very often, and I smile because every time we get that email, my colleagues and I have a list of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of imams, of professors, of countries, of religious leaders who are distancing themselves from that. And you just send that email and say, well, maybe you didn't see all of these. And the media sometimes tells this story and sometimes it does not. One of the powers that we have when we do this together is that I can help tell your story and you can help tell my story. So that third area, we talked about religion, as something that anti-Jewish and anti-Islamic sentiment has in common. We talked about power and politics and those conspiracy theories that say that Jews and Muslims are seeking power in secret and dangerous ways. And then this third area that's different, I talked about the false accusation that if you're Muslim, you must be a terrorist. And what we experience in the Jewish community is not as much about terrorism, but it is connected to Israel and Zionism. And the perception, because we know that there is a conflict, and that conflict breaks our hearts. And the vast majority of Jews in the world and in Israel want to see a peaceful two-state solution. They want to see the dignity of Palestinians uplifted. They want to see sovereignty for Palestinians and their own state at the same time that there is security for the Jews who are living in that country as well, or in that land. But what we often see is that when there are negative things that happen in that conflict, somehow all Jews everywhere becomes responsible. And somehow the religion of Judaism, people believe out there that the religion of Judaism is teaching the oppression of Palestinians. And there is a connection between the worst hatred that can be seen among the few voices and all Jews everywhere. We also see that there are people out there who, when they criticize Israel, and of course, Israel, like every country on the planet, should be criticized for bad policies and bad actions. And you can see in Israeli newspapers and media and American Jewish media and American media, there's plenty of criticism of that country, and some of it is very justified. When I talk about a certain kind of criticism that comes from hatred, what I'm saying is when you demonize a whole country, when that country becomes demonic because it is Jewish, and if you say, I'm not going to talk about any Muslim country this way, I'm not going to talk about a Christian country this way, I'm not going to talk about a Hindu or a secular country this way, but only the Jewish state, then sometimes we ask the question, is that political criticism, or is that somehow criticizing Jews, Judaism, and the Jewish people? This is a very tricky area because we have to be able to, as Jews, we have to be able to elevate those voices of moderation and to allow for criticism, which we do, of course. But also, we need allies who can understand when that line is crossed. And when it's not about a political state, but it's actually about Jews and Judaism. Very, very challenging to do this work. So those, just to review, we talked about hate as something that comes out of difference, but difference does not need to be a cause for hate. We talked about attitudes that can be based on anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim feeling, rhetoric when we speak or on social media tweet or post in anti-Jewish ways, and then action, violent actions. When we talked about the history and tropes, the common expressions of anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim sentiment, we talked about those that are based on religion, those that are based on power and politics, and then those different ones, one that has to do with terrorism and extremism, and one that has to do with Israel and Zionism. Let me come back to the election because we talked about those problems. That polarization and identity politics means that sometimes when I talk about anti-Semitism or if I talk about Islamophobia, it becomes a tool to shut down conversation and it becomes politicized. Then there are that challenge where the suspicion that is built in for Jews and Muslims sometimes comes out as well. And the third thing we said was fear that if I connect these two, I'm embracing everything. If I fight Islamophobia as a Jew, I somehow am soft on all of these negative expressions of extremism. If I embrace anti-Semitism as a Muslim, somehow I am embracing everything that the state of Israel has done and I am becoming a Zionist. right? These things are not true. So let me close by saying a little bit of what we are doing and a little bit of what I think can be done. I talked to you about the Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council. And this is a project that I help oversee with American Jewish Committee, and it's a partnership with the largest American Muslim group, the Islamic Society of North America. And together, we have councils in 11 different major cities in the United States and a national council. And it's not just religious leaders. It is not just interfaith dialogue. We bring together CEOs of major companies. We bring together policy leaders, lawyers, educators, actors and actresses in Hollywood and in New York, and of course, rabbis and imams and chaplains. And the voice that we have together is against hatred of any Americans in the United States because of their religion or ethnicity. We fight hate crimes. The laws that protect Muslims and Jews in our country are stronger because the Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council came together to help the government change those laws. Our Congress held 8 hearings, 8 special hearings about white supremacy, those groups that are pushing back against both Jews, Muslims, African Americans, immigrants, all kinds of minorities, because Muslims and Jews came together and said this country needs to be safer for everyone. We are celebrating the partnerships, and we are making sure that the United States is a place where Jewish identity and Muslim identity can also be a part of American identity. And we are doing this work as well in Europe and across the world. What can you do before we get to conversation? And I know I want to acknowledge that I said many things that may be very, you may disagree with, and you may have questions about. And I want to engage in our discussion in the second half of this program in that very lively and active discussion. It's so rare and unusual for us to have this chance to encounter and to have this discussion. Zoom makes this possible for us. And when I told my parents I was going to be teaching a group of students and faculty and others in Indonesia, they said, your grandparents, if they had been alive, would have been amazed, because they never could have imagined a world where Jews and Muslims from across the planet could be having not just a conversation about religion, not just an interfaith dialogue about easy topics, but a very, very difficult discussion. This is one of the most difficult discussions that there is in Muslim-Jewish relations. So what can we do about this? So we talked about attitudes and rhetoric and action. So let's talk about the counterparts to that. Education is one of the ways that we shape attitudes. We read about the other. We meet with the other and learn about them. So many sociologists in the United States will say that the 2 best predictors of whether someone has positive attitudes about Jews or Muslims, meaning when you are lower on the anti-Semitism score index, or you're a lower expression of Islamophobia, there are 2 things that are about that. One, the first, have you been educated about Judaism? Have you been educated about Islam? So one thing is read, watch videos from responsible Jewish and Muslim voices on YouTube, participate in lectures like this one. And 2, do you know someone from the other community? This one may be more challenging for our friends in Indonesia, where the Jewish community is a little smaller. But my colleagues at AJC's Asia Pacific Institute are a great resource for you to connect to Jewish voices to learn more. And I know when I tell my friends and post on my own social media about programs like this, there are people who want to connect with you. So one thing is learn about Judaism, meet Jews. With the same thing we tell our community, learn about Islam, meet Muslims. That is for our attitudes. For rhetoric, I think when we talk about rhetoric, we're talking about speech, things that someone says or posts. So the answer is counter speech. That when you hear someone saying something anti-Jewish or anti-Muslim, you have to speak up. At American Jewish Committee, you can follow our social media, but we will often, in American public life, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't matter if we agree with you or we disagree with you. If you say something anti-Semitic or Islamophobic, we will post and criticize that, because no speech should be without counter speech. And for us in our own homes, we have to be what Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, who wrote a wonderful book about anti-Semitism, calls the impolite dinner guest. When you are having dinner with your family or with another party at a group of people, and you hear something that is said negatively about another community and you know it to be false, you have to find a respectful way to say, that's not okay. We don't agree with that. I met, and I see this in my own community, when someone at my table speaks about Islam or Muslims in a certain way, I have to say, I love you very dearly as a friend, but I know what you're saying to be false. And it also is not helpful to us as Jews to hear hateful speech like that. And the request that I make of my Muslim friends is that they do the same. And finally, when we talk about actions, when we see violent actions that happen against another community, we can do two things. One, to prevent these things from happening, we need strong laws that help us. We need laws that empower our law enforcement and our governments to stop hate crimes before they start. But when they do happen, we need to speak up and we need to show solidarity. We were incredibly moved as a Jewish community when that shooting in the synagogue in Pittsburgh happened. Muslims around the country and around the world raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to help the families of the victims, to help rebuild the synagogue. American Jewish Committee and other groups, when the shootings happened in New Zealand, did the same. We raised money to help support the victims' families in those attacked communities. We saw vigils, people, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others gathering when Jews are attacked, when Muslims are attacked, to protect, to show solidarity, to show you are not alone. Since 9/11 in the United States, there has been a certain perception that we talked about that all Muslims are responsible for acts of terror. One of the most beautiful stories is that a mosque in downtown Manhattan, not too far from where the Twin Towers fell, there was a mosque that was being attacked. And every single Friday, every Jummah, for the last 20 years, there's been a group of Jews that comes and stands around outside and says, we stand with you. We are your protectors. We are your friends. And the message that we need to send to the world is that you cannot divide us easily. That there are many voices who want to use the politics of the world, to use international conflicts, and to use polarization to say, if you are friends with Jews or if you're protecting Jews, you're an enemy of Islam. And if you celebrate Islam and if you are friends with Muslims, you're an enemy of the Jews. We have to fight back against this because we know that it is not true to our religions, it is not true to our humanity, and it is not what God wants from us. God wants from us to stand together. And I'll close with this, the way that I started, that Professor Ken Stern, who told me that hatred is something that we can never get rid of. As long as there is human difference, there will always be those who want to use that difference to push for hatred. And what our job to do is to push back, is to make sure that it is as small as possible. that it is not the mainstream of our communities, but the fringe of our societies, that it doesn't get the most likes on social media, that the most likes come from those who celebrate difference. I told you I'm a student of Islam. One of my favorite verses in the Quran says that why did God create human difference? Why did God create people in tribes and nations, male and female? Lita'arafu, so that we would know one another. And in Jewish tradition as well, we see that God created all humanity from Adam and Eve, from just one or two people, but we see how different everyone looks and how different everyone practices and how different everyone believes. And this is a celebration of God, because when a king, if a king, this is what the rabbis of the Talmud, our ancient tradition, tell us, if a king makes coins and he stamps those coins, every single coin comes out the same way. But when the King of Kings, when God creates coins from one stamp, from Adam and Eve, they all look different. And this is a celebration of our diversity and a holy, holy act. Our job in this world is to reach across those divides and push back against that hatred, so that we know that the goodness that is there in all of us as people and the holiness that is there in our religions is the story that we tell about each other and the story that shines through. As I said, I would love to see everyone's faces who would like to share them and to have this conversation together with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Ari Gordon, for your presentation. It's not only lightening, but also to some extent clarifying misinformations. Well, this program is part of our institution's public education, and you mentioned that one of the ways we can combat, we can resist this hatred. You talk about the mechanics of hatred, the attitude, rhetoric, inaction, misinformation, is via education. And we are here for dialogue, indeed. And Ari mentioned about one of the principles of interfaith dialogue in Islam, and that is lita'arafu, to know each other. It's not only that Muslims want to be known by other people of different faith, but also we want also to know other faith and other people of different faith. And the participants of this program is not only students of CRCS and ICRS who are studying religion, but also people from the public. And just to share to you about Indonesian experience, I would say that the vast majority, Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country in the world. The vast majority of Muslims here in Indonesia, and I would say around, well, more than 95% perhaps, never met any Jew in person. And so that means information is spreading quite a lot, and usually we can easily come across a book about Judaism or about Jewish communities, and when the word Judaism or a Jewish is mentioned, the two things that are easily coming up to the minds of many people here are, usually between conspiracies or what is happening in Palestine or Israel. So what was talked about, what was presented by Dr. Ari Gordon was actually to clarify those misinformation. So I would ask to the people here in Zoom, but also people who are watching via YouTube, to if you want to ask questions or make comments, please do it in a way that is in line with the principle of lita'arafu, the principle of interfaith dialogue, to know each other in a friendly way and peaceful way, respectful way. So, well, perhaps to begin with, before we are taking questions, just to, can we go to some basics here about perhaps demography? How many Jews there are there in the US? And how many Jews are compared to the Jews in Europe? And a bit history of the early Muslim Jewish encounters in the US. And perhaps one thing that's a bit about key here, the difference between Judaism as a religion and Jewish people as, I don't know what is the best way to describe it, as an ethnic group or as a group identity. Well, you can start with that first, and then we can take questions later.
Sure. There's a lot there. Thank you, Aziz, for telling, for clarifying the discussion for all those. And as I said, it's remarkable that your institution is hosting this series of lectures on so many different topics. Everyone who has tuned in for the first time, you should continue to come to the Wednesday talks. They're amazing. In thinking, so you asked about, if I understood, you asked about Jewish identity broadly, the early Muslim Jewish encounters and the history of those, and also just some demographics.
Yeah.
So I'm curious from the people who have access to the chat, how many, first let's see, everybody put in, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? Don't Google it. If you know it, you know it, but just take a guess, and it's okay. It's okay to be wrong. How many Jews are there on the planet?
I even don't know.
Yeah.
Can I unmute myself to guess?
Yeah, or you
unmuted.
put it in the chat, or you can say so. Yeah, please.
It's not 100. 50 million? No?
50 million.
20 million?
Okay, 50 million or 20 million is a guess. Some people say 23% of, I see 23% of the world population.
Perhaps 2.3.
2.3. Okay. It's a very interesting. So what are there? There are about 8 billion people on the planet. We think about 1.5 billion Muslims, maybe 2 billion Christians. Jews on the planet are 14 or 15 million. So 0.00 whatever 1%. In the United States, where in North America, Canada, the US, and Mexico, we are about 6.5 or 7 million. Israel, Palestine is about 7 million as well. And then there's 1 or 2 million living in other parts of the world, including Europe and Australia and South Africa and other parts of Asia. So it is a lot smaller sometimes than it seems. And you do ask this question, for a small community like ours, why is there all this focus? For some people, this plays into the conspiracy theories that if a small group is being talked about so widely, there must be something secretive and magical going on about this. My sense is that there are 2 or 3 reasons why this is. Probably the most important reason is because of the other religions, because of Christianity and because of Islam. That both Christianity and Islam value the Torah, the Christians call the Old Testament, we call it the Hebrew Bible, or the Torah, and value Judaism as a community that God spoke to and gave a message to. Of course, there are some people who believe that that God moved on from us, but we know that many in the Christian and Muslim communities still recognize Judaism and Jews as part of their story. So even if the identity is one where we say Judaism is part of our history, it still is an important part of the identity of 3.5, 4 billion people on the planet. So one thing is because of you. And in fact, Maimonides, one of the greatest scholars in Jewish history who lived in the 12th century, died in 1204, he wrote this in one of his books of law when he was celebrating Islam and Christianity. And he came from a community that was asking him, if God is with us as Jews, why are there Christians and Muslims in the world? And what he said is, Judaism is a small community. We do not seek to convert others. We are not looking to spread Judaism around the world. A person can convert to Judaism. There is a special process for doing so, but we don't go out there to missionize. All are welcome, but we also acknowledge that a person can live a very holy life as another religion. And Maimonides said, in fact, Christianity and Islam are much better at spreading monotheism and God's message in the world because they are outward facing, because they are bringing people to understand justice and ethics and holiness of God's message in the world. And Maimonides said that this is paving the way for the Messiah to come. Now, Jews, Christians, and Muslims might disagree about who the Messiah is and what the world will look like in that time, but that's maybe a conversation for another lecture. For Maimonides, I found it always very special that he celebrated Christianity and Islam, and for us as Jews, it's a part of why the world tells our story is because of you. The other thing I think is that in the 20th century, I know that many people are not familiar with the Holocaust and the ethnic cleansing and extermination of half of the Jews of Europe, of 6 million Jews during World War II. I know people on this call, because of the setting that you are coming from, you probably have heard that term. We don't have time to go into all of it, but that event where the Nazi Germany and other countries collaborated to murder 1/3 of my people. My great grandparents were killed. My mother's parents were survivors of that war before they came to the United States. While the world watched and allowed it to happen, that genocide, that event is something that became a part of world history. I think the United Nations was founded in the wake of World War I and World War II. So that event became a big piece of that story. And when the world said never again, that we are going to work together to celebrate the human rights of all and protect the human rights of every individual, many people had in their mind that tragedy in Europe that was not only against Jews. There were many political prisoners that were executed, many other communities, people who had a different sexuality, a different political identity, people with special needs and mental inabilities, the Sinti and Roma. The idea of human rights came out to some extent of the conversation after World War II. Jews were a part of that story. So I think that's part of why people tell our story as well. And of course, today, the state of Israel as a Jewish state and the ongoing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians that so many of us Jews here in the United States and in Israel wish to end, and so many Muslims around the world wish to see come to a peaceful end. But because that conflict is there in the headlines, I think that also is a reason, sometimes not in a positive way, that people are looking at this small community of 15 million people in the world. Of course, Jews value education. We have lived for thousands of years as a minority community. And so that has always meant we have had to be educated. We have had to work with governments as best we can. So we do advocacy. We try to impact our countries that we live in, but that's not the same thing as saying we control everything through some kind of secret plan where we are on a Zoom call every other week to talk about how we're controlling the world. That does not exist. Or if it does, I have never met any single Jew who has been invited to that call. That's a joke. There is no call.
All right. There is this question sent to me privately on Zoom from Husada from Banyuwangi, East Java. Thank you very much for the interesting explanation, Dr. Gordon. I would like to hear your opinion on this. Another challenge I think worth to discuss on this topic is the diversity of groups inside each Muslim and Jewish community itself, that each group claims to be the true representative of their respective religion. So how should an outsider identify that this is the real Islam or this is the real Judaism when there are various views or competing interpretations? Yeah.
This is, this is a wonderful question. And one of the deep challenges in all areas of interreligious relations is who speaks for that community? Who speaks for that group? For us at American Jewish Committee, we don't claim to speak for all Jews, but we do celebrate the fact, and we're proud of the fact, that we have Jews of all different backgrounds, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, meaning various traditional and also liberal and progressive practices. We have people from all the different political parties, from the ethnic backgrounds. We try to be as diverse and representative as we can. And when we engage with Muslim communities, we are not only speaking to Indonesian Muslims, we're not only speaking to Nahdlatul Ulama, we're not only speaking to Muhammadiyah, we're not only speaking to any particular group, but we're also speaking to Shia, Sunni, we're speaking to Muslims from Arab countries, from Africa, from Asia, from Pakistan and India and Kashmir and Indonesia, and in the United States, all of the Muslims of those backgrounds, and of course, African-American Muslims as well. Part of the challenge is trying to have as many voices at the table as you can. But what I would say, because there is not a great answer to this, I would say that one of the great founders of the field of interreligious dialogue was a Lutheran Christian bishop, Krister Stendahl. And he had some principles of dialogue. And one of them, well, two of them are relevant here. One was, don't compare the best of my religion to the worst of your religion. So I cannot talk about how Judaism celebrates justice and harmony and interfaith peace and pluralism, and then point to difficult teachings in Islam and in Christianity that tell a different story, that talk about war and violence. And if I hear someone who's a Muslim friend talking only about those Muslim Islamic teachings that are about harmony and interfaith solidarity, but then pointing to my tradition and the places where violence comes up in my tradition, that's also not fair. You have to compare the best of one to the best of the other, or have a realistic picture that all of our communities have extremists. All of our communities have people who want to take the religion and use it for a negative purpose. And of course, thankfully, blessedly, all of our communities have the majority of people who want to use the religion for good purposes, to take care of our families, our friends, to be a force for justice and peacemaking in the world. This is true for Judaism as it is for Christianity and Islam. So you can't compare the best of your own community to the worst of another community. The other thing to do when we're talking about the question of voices and representation, when you read a story in the newspaper, or when you hear someone talking about Judaism or Christianity or Islam, and you don't see an insider voice, when it's only someone from the outside talking about that religion, you have to ask, what would someone who is part of that community say? So if I read a story in American newspapers and it's talking about Islam and Muslims, but it doesn't quote any Muslim in the story, I know that it is missing something. It's missing a voice from the inside as a representative voice. So for you, as you hear stories about Judaism, and when you read things, ask yourself, is this the story that Jews are telling? And then, of course, there are those, we know this in the United States, there are those Jews who are a very small group who want to tell the story that certain Muslims want to hear. They want to say Jews have no connection to Israel or Palestine. They want to say that any Jew who is a Zionist is a bad Jew, is an evil person. And these Jews sometimes are the ones that make it into media in the Arab world and in other parts of the world. And it's true that there are also Muslim voices who want to say Islam is a violent religion. The only true Islam is one that goes through a radical reformation, and the only Muslims you can trust are this very small group. And those voices sometimes make their way into Jewish circles and Jewish communities. Some of what we need to do is not to allow the fringe voices in our communities to represent the whole. And that's true when we're talking about violent extremists, and it's true when we're talking about political extremists whose voices just don't represent the whole community.
Thank you so much. Ari mentioned about that principle of not comparing the best of our community with the worst of another community. That was actually also studied at CRCS in interfaith dialogue course. And if I'm not mistaken, the term for that principle, actually there are 10 principles. It's called the Decalogue. And for those who are here can Google it. So the Decalogue, 10 principles of interfaith dialogue. Now, I will take questions from everyone here. So you can raise your virtual hands. You can write on your questions, but please be respectful, yeah. And yeah, now there is one, Tata Susityo.
Can I unmute
Yeah,
myself?
yeah,
All right.
yeah. You can
So
also show yourself if you want, but if you don't want, then up to you.
I think I'm currently in audio. So it's been said that if it's better for us to not allow fringe voices to represent, right? But sometimes when we talk about some that part of the conflict, for example, we need to see both sides, and sometimes what represents us, as far as I remember, does not represent our voice. For example, sometimes I feel that, oh, both voices need to be heard, and somehow seeing from the other point of view, sometimes I feel it expressed might be that dangerous, because sometimes because I see some kind of, excuse me, bigotry can be deeply rooted, like in our minds or something. So how can we actually start to find to finally voice out, to make sure that uh, that our that these smaller voices can be heard? Can we start from actually either writing or uh, or just either publicly asking or something, that have you if you've heard about this, where did you hear about this, blah blah blah? Because sometimes conspiracies like those stereotypes comes really fast, and we just and sometimes part of us believe it just right away without any verifications, etc. So what can I conclude is, how can we start to make that way to finally make these voices being heard first, that in the end will represent the whole community? how can we start? Like, can we counter speech them first, for example? Because sometimes sometimes I feel it's hard to let's say uh, to it's hard to say in it's hard to voice in the in an environment when bigotry is deeply rooted.
Tata, if I may summarize, your question is about how to voice the voiceless. Is that correct?
Yeah, how to voice the voiceless. Can we start small from counter speech, especially from what I see, bigotry is deeply rooted here.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Tata, you're pointing to a really big challenge, which is sometimes when we look out there and we see the magnitude, the size, how big is the misunderstanding, and sometimes how big the bigotry is, it's easy to get overwhelmed and to say, how can I do this? What is it that I can do that will even be one drop in the ocean here? And I think there's two things I want to say, because like with so many of these wonderful, wonderful questions, the questions are bigger than anyone can give you as an answer. But maybe a way to start thinking about it is, yeah, as you said, sometimes when we live in a society, there are people around us, sometimes our own family members, sometimes our community, that we see participating in a culture of bigotry. So I want to make one distinction that may be helpful. And that is to think about something that is hateful in its intent and hateful in its impact. So if I think about anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, there may be something where someone says it and their intention is to spread hatred of Jews, and their intention is to spread hatred of Muslims. But that's different from when someone says something or does something, and it's not because they have met Jews and have made a decision, I hate all Jews. It's because there's a culture and a language around them that they are participating in. I know people who will often say the word Islamic terrorist, and they don't believe that Islam is a terrorist religion. They don't believe that all Muslims are terrorists, but sometimes the media talks about it and says Islamic terrorist, connecting those two things. And what we need to do is to teach them to say, it's not Islamic terrorist, maybe it's a terrorist acting with a perverted interpretation of Islam, a terrorist who is acting on a certain ideology that is not representative. It's sometimes, so the terminology can matter. For you in your area, yeah, what I want to say, and I see we're coming to time, maybe this is a good concluding remark for me, is that you have an opportunity. And some of your opportunity in the world where social media can be a tool to spread negative feelings of the other, social media can be a tool to spread hatred. It also is a great opportunity. Facebook groups, Twitter, Instagram, you can participate with others in a way that crosses boundaries. You can find allies and friends and allow your voice to be heard even outside of where you live in your local area. But also where you live in your local area, you are not responsible for the entire world. You are not responsible for your entire religion. You do have some responsibility for the people around you. Maybe I'll end with this teaching from some of our great sages, a book called Pirkei Avot, the teachings of our ancestors. And this is a book of Jewish wisdom from rabbis of the first centuries. And one of the things they say is, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor v'lo ata ben chorin lihivatel mimena. That is the Hebrew. And it says, your job is not to finish the work. You don't have the responsibility to finish the task, but you are also not free to not do anything. you cannot desist from trying to make good. So there is a lot of work we have to do. The world is not a perfect place. And it is not anyone's job here, not you or you or you, to finish all of that work. But you have to pick up the gauntlet, and you have to do the parts that you can. And I hope that what you've heard today has given you something to think about, and also maybe given you some motivation to pick up that work and to join us, because we know that when we fight this hatred together, when we have friends when we do it, we can be all that much more effective. And you will always have partners with us at American Jewish Committee and at American Jewish Committee's Asia Pacific Institute. And of course, you have wonderful opportunity to engage with ICRS and CRCS. We see you as friends, and you should see us as friends as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So those are concluding remarks. Actually, yeah, we have already passed 10 p.m. here in Jogja, but actually we are quite flexible about when we finish this event. But yeah, do you prefer to take another comment or questions, or we finish at this point? Which one do you prefer?
I believe I have another meeting to go to.
All right.
But I am more than happy for anyone who is here to send questions by email and to continue the conversation. And please God, inshallah, we'll meet again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ari Gordon, for your wonderful presentation and your teaching, your lecture here. So there is one word that the Jews and the Muslims would say almost the same way of pronunciation, and that is salam or shalom, I believe.
Shalom alaikum, salam alaikum, right?
Yeah,
Salam
salam alaikum and shalom alaikum. There are many or much more similarities because Islam and Judaism came from the same root rather than the differences that divide us. And one of the principles of interfaith dialogue is to focus more on the similarities rather than the differences that may make some people to exploit them, and we are being politicized by those people, as was mentioned and discussed by Dr. Ari Gordon. So people here, thank you so much once again for Ari and also other participants. This is a weekly forum, and we will have another topic next week. If the speaker is not decided yet, but we are contacting Professor Amin Abdullah is going to talk about transdisciplinary studies of Islam, and we will have another topic in the next 2 weeks up until mid-December. So stay tuned with our social media, and we hope that we can see you again next week. Thank you so much.